Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris at Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our good friend Sam Clement. Sam, say hello.
Hey, John, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I hope you're doing well today.
I am. I can't complain.
Well, I can't complain either.
Some people probably.
Some people are complaining. Matter of fact, I think a lot of those people live in Ottawa.
I think you're probably pretty spot on.
And I think if I were living in Ottawa and listening to trucks blare their horns for up to 16 hours a day and snarling up traffic and all that good stuff or bad stuff as the case may be, I think I'd probably be pretty fed up with it.
I think there's just the tensions are high is probably a good way to put it.
Well,
Everyone's probably pretty tense right now.
Well, this pandemic, here we are going on 2 years of lockdowns, mask mandates, all that stuff, and I think people are probably pretty fed up. And, one place where I wouldn't have thought we'd seen that much political pressure would have been our friends to the Great White North.
They're known as what? The nicest people on earth?
Listen, I've been to Canada. I loved my experience
I love
in Canada.
Canada.
And so,
my mom was born in Canada.
Yeah, there you have it. So, I've both been there. People were absolutely awesome, beautiful. I just had nothing but great things to say about my time in Canada. But they did not necessarily, the Canadians did not strike me necessarily as MAGA hat wearing. Well, there was no reason for them to be MAGA hat wearing, but I think you catch my drift.
Yeah.
They're not that type of crowd, that type of sort of conservative, forget hell, all that type of stuff. And they just didn't strike me as that. And so it is with some measure of surprise when I see some of the most visible, long-lasting sort of protests and just demonstrations against mask mandates and government responses to pandemics. I would not have thought that it would have come out of, again, Canada.
Our nice friends to the north. But no, you're right. But the more you read about this, the more you can just almost feel the frustration behind why they're doing this. This is a pretty extreme, I think still pretty peaceful protest, but it's pretty extreme in what they're doing. They're shutting down roads. They're shutting down the bridges to Detroit. That's a big part of the auto industry.
Yes.
They're people. You just don't see this level of coordinated protest with money being thrown at it from people that aren't involved. It just seems like, this seems pretty unique in the developed world.
Well, it seems pretty unique in the developed world, and the thing about it is, I don't know just how much of it is just kind of fostered by the fact that our friends to the Great White North are bordering up against a country that does not have the same measure of restrictions it has. And then you have places in certain parts of Canada that are heavily reliant on the tourism industry, where you and I both went in Alberta. That's certainly, very reliant on the tourism industry. And just cross-border traffic just in general, that, they are seeing, the lack of as strong a mandates in the United States. And I guess if I were living in Canada and walking around and I got to have this here, I've got to have that there, I'm not allowed here, I've got all this, that, and the other thing, I might resent it a little bit myself. But that's obviously speaking as an American, trying to put myself in the shoes of a Canadian.
Well, this has caused serious economic issues at this point. There's, I think it was the Ford plant that had to shut down because of the bridge shutdown in Detroit. So there's ramifications coming from this. It's not just a one day protest and everyone goes home kind of thing. It's really caused a storm.
Well, apparently after the policemen cleared the bridges and all that stuff in Windsor, apparently protesters out in, I think, Saskatchewan and then also Alberta have closed down some pretty major cross-border traffic lanes and all that stuff. So, although they did clear up that one, the Freedom Bridge or something like that, I don't think this is going to end. And it's difficult to determine whether or not Canadians as a whole support it or don't support it, because while obviously it's probably the more conservative elements of Canadian society that are protesting, Canada as a whole is a more liberal country than we are, just as a whole. And people might be hard-pressed to believe that, but generally it is. However, some of the polls that I've read is, okay, you proved your point, go home. It's more the nuisance that the protesters have caused and made out of themselves, as opposed to the reasons behind the protests. And that's where I can't get a good gauge whether or not Canadians are fed up with the reasons for the protests or the protests themselves.
Well, I think it's, again, just so interesting that, this is a protest that's actually causing issues, which is part of, I feel like, what you're trying to do with a protest is get people to pay attention. And that, I think you're right, that people probably, some may agree with it and are just tired of it impacting their lives, but they're doing a pretty damn good job of shaking things up and doing what you think a protest is supposed to do. I mean, this is Canadian truckers, and it is one of the top stories on the news pretty much every day. Meanwhile, there's conflicts going on over in Ukraine, and this is maybe even more talked about.
Well, and you bring up a very good point. Canadian truckers make up a very small demographic in the overall global population.
And it was less than even 10% of the truckers that are unvaccinated, which was the original issue here. So this is a small group of a pretty small country in the grand scheme of things. So
you bring up a very good point. If you really think about the size of the protest here, 80%, from what I've read, 80% of the Canadian population, that includes all ages, have been vaccinated. And I would imagine, probably as it is here in the United States, some of that 20% that isn't vaccinated might be 5 and under, 10 and under, that type of stuff. Another 5% has been partially vaccinated. So this is as of data I've read from a couple weeks ago. So 85% of the population up there is vaccinated in some form or fashion. So you're looking at a very small portion of the landscape or the population up there that has not been vaccinated, and yet here you're having these protests. Intuitively, and just numbers would suggest, there are plenty of people who are out there protesting, blocking bridges and snarling up traffic who, strangely enough, have been vaccinated.
Yeah.
So is it about the mandate for the vaccinations, or the government's just sort of ham-handedness and heavy-handedness about all of it?
I think it's kind of both, but more so the latter. I mean, and that's what I think maybe the main takeaway is I don't think this is a uniquely Canadian thing or a uniquely Canadian trucker thing. I mean, you're seeing people kind of all over the country in areas that have been, very strong governments through the past 2 years through the pandemic, and a lot of people are just getting very tired of it. I mean, you saw the San Francisco, I don't know if you saw the San Francisco, I think it was the Board of Education, is recalling 3 of their members. That seems like people must be pretty dang tired of what the San Francisco Board of Education is doing if they're going to recall 3 members with a pretty strong vote to recall them.
Well, it's a pretty strong vote to recall them, and one of the people that are being recalled, the one by the name of Collins, I can't remember her first name, it escapes me right now, but she said, I don't really understand what's going on. My policies have not changed. That's what people voted for. They voted me in to do what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of one of those deals that I'm not sure if people really have gotten it in the past. It's one thing to vote with your heart or vote this is the way things should be, until all of a sudden that's what you get.
Yeah.
And that's kind of maybe what we're seeing with Canadian truckers and protests across the United States is, hey, I don't mind being vaccinated, and I want the world to all be a happy place, and this blah, blah, blah. These people are saying happy things, and then you vote for them, and then all of a sudden they do exactly what they say they're going to do,
right,
and you take issue with it. And it seems to be kind of what's going on.
I think that's always an issue, people not understanding fully what they're voting for on both sides, and, a lot of people vote for a party more so than a policy, mm-hmm. And then people get shocked when that policy that the person said they were going to enact ends up impacting the person, and they just didn't even realize it. So, I mean, I don't think that's a new thing, but I think the strength of some of these lockdowns and the measures that some of these government officials have put in place has made more people realize what they were voting for or what those people's policies were.
Well, and interestingly enough, or scarily enough, I mean, at least by an American's standards, is recently, in order to get all those trucks and truckers off the bridges in Windsor and kind of dissipate some of the snarling traffic in Ottawa and what have you, if I'm not mistaken, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued something called the Emergencies Act.
Yeah, it's like the first time I think in 50 plus years.
I think it's ever been done. I mean, his father did something when there were a rash of kidnappings back in the 70s and 80s. But in terms of this particular piece of legislation, they passed it in 1988, and it's the first time they've ever done it, and it's pretty it's just a step short of martial law.
Yeah.
Truthfully,
I mean,
from the way I'm reading it again as an American, and I'm just going to read it. I mean, it's just Emergency Act outlines four different. This is from the BBC. The Emergency Act outlines four different types of emergencies: public welfare emergencies, public order emergencies, international emergencies, and war emergencies. If the legislation is invoked, it will likely be under the public order category. Again, the criteria is strict. Lawful protests don't qualify. Instead, the situation must be considered a threat to the security of Canada, as defined by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act. This law outlines four possible scenarios: espionage or sabotage, foreign-influenced activities, threats or use of serious violence for political, religious, or ideological objectives, covert, unlawful acts intended to undermine or overthrow the constitutionally established government. So, I don't think that I think it's pretty easy to argue that, hey, COVID, all that stuff,
sure, it's
might be a public emergency.
Pretty broad net, though.
Yeah, that's a pretty broad net. However, taking a look at what they have done and trying to squeeze it into espionage or sabotage, foreign influenced activities, although they can say a lot of American conservatives and the far-right Christian groups have been funding a lot of these people, threats or use of serious violence or covert unlawful acts intended to undermine or overthrow the government. I guess this is where there are cultural differences. You know, someone doing that to a bridge, you know, I don't know. They need to be removed from the bridge. Don't get me wrong. But in terms of calling out
shutting
national
down
emergency,
bank accounts,
and that's the next step. And that's, for Americans listening to this, it gives this National Emergencies Act does give the government power or to authorize the banks to freeze people's assets.
Yeah.
And it goes a little bit further. And for an American's way of thinking, I mean, just like, oh, I can't believe this is happening. However, this is the way that it is in a lot of countries around the world that, to an American point of view, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the Parliament has to confirm this within a week.
They do, and then it's like for 30 days and
Yeah.
all that stuff. So it's not quite martial law that, you think of in a third
Sure.
world country or what have you. But, getting back to the reasons for the protests, there's a ton of just pent-up frustration everywhere. And, for me, it's just kind of taking a look at all of it. And obviously, we live in a very conservative area of the country. I've traveled to other parts of the country where people wear a mask and just don't pay attention. They're far more focused on the pandemic than we are. Some of it is maybe just love of freedom. Others, we just don't like being told what to do. However, it is interesting where there has been a tradition of greater governmental interference or influence in your life is a greater willingness to accept mandates from the government than in areas where there has been a less strong central government presence.
Yeah. It just seems like our area, there's no appetite for it. There hasn't been, and it's hard to imagine there ever being a ton of appetite for it.
And unless a lot of people move here, which, a lot of people are moving to Tennessee, North Carolina, or what have you, from Texas, but not a lot of people necessarily.
We're not getting the big influx of population. The census wasn't as kind to us as some other.
That's because we just didn't fill it out.
Yeah,
So we don't need the government knowing where we're living. Come on. But kind of going back to Canada, I mean, Sam, if this is going on in Canada, how much longer is it before we start really seeing this really kind of explode throughout Western Europe, the remainder of the developed world, and even what would have been second world countries or Eastern Europe? We have seen some of this go on, but to the extent, as we mentioned here, Canada's population, 35 million maybe, around like that. It's the smallest of the G7 countries. Truckers in Canada make up a pretty small percentage, so we're looking at a very small number of protests. I mean, people protesting, and it is a global story. Huge headlines here. BBC, huge headlines, massive amount of print on this. So I guess part of it is you sit there and think, oh, Canada, it's not in the news terribly often. So when something like this happens, it kind of like, what in the world? What's going on? So there must be something else this must be resonating with other people.
Yeah, my thought is I think we're getting close to the end with a lot of these mandates, and I think I think you're going to see some governments seeing what's going on in Canada and just the resentment that a lot of people clearly have towards the government policies. And I think you're seeing it in some countries starting to relax policies and realizing that the ineffectiveness of a lot of these policies. And you're still going to see some stragglers, but I think the more protests you see, and I think you're going to see more resentment and frustration in countries, I think we're getting close to the end. Hopefully. I mean, I think San Francisco school board's a perfect example. I mean, if it's happening in San Francisco, there's not too many places far behind it.
Well, just I agree with you on that, but I going back to Canada, I keep on saying that, going back to Canada, one of the things that strikes me as very peculiar about all this is, Canada locked down its borders for a long period of time. Mm-hmm. In an effort to stem or halt the flow of the COVID vaccine.
Virus, not the vaccine.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The virus. Who knows? Maybe the vaccine, but the virus. And here we are. I mean, the best way of kind of keeping that cross-border spread down would be to actually close the borders with the United States, as opposed to making truckers from the United States wear a mask. You just don't let people from the United States in. You don't let Canadians out. Hey, man, that stops the spread of the virus across country borders, and yet here the government is opening up borders again. So it's kind of hypocritical in that regard. But I guess my point is money talks.
Money does talk. That's I think that the end result of all these podcasts is at the end of the day, everything comes down to dollars and cents.
It comes down to dollars and cents, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. Unfortunately, bills have to get paid. People have to have jobs. Taxes need to be collected. All that good stuff. And when you're inhibiting cross-border trade for a country that is as heavily reliant on trade with the United States as Canada is, that ultimately has a very negative impact. The government mandated it for a while for personal traffic, and then they realized this is not good. So they don't mind having a mandate on vaccines and masks, but by God, don't.
Please come.
Please come and
support our tourism.
And let's not stop this let's not stop this economic growth again. So it's that's kind of where many governments are, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens moving forward. Whether or not the populations of countries like Canada, even the United States, Western Europe, Japan, elsewhere, are going to sit there and be as docile or as compliant as they have been over the last 2 years by wearing masks and mandates and crazy things. And I think it really does depend on geography as much as anything else.
I think you're right.
All right, guys, thank you all so much for listening. We always love to hear from you all. So if you have any questions or comments, please, by all means, let us know. You can always drop us a line at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, or you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. As always, if you're interested in listening to more or hearing more of what we have to say or how we think, please, by all means, go to oakworth.com and take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab for all kinds of interesting information. Sam, any last words on this topic here today?
That's all I got.
That's all I've got today, too. Y'all take care.